Before revelation ever descended, before verses were revealed, before a mission was announced to the world, he was already different, and this is something we often overlook. We sometimes imagine that his greatness began at 40, when Jibril came to him in the cave. But the reality is, Allah was preparing him long before that moment. His character was already being shaped in a society that had very little regard for morality, truth, or restraint. And yet, he stood apart so clearly that even his enemies could not deny it. He grew up in Makkah, a society drowning in idol worship, tribal arrogance, injustice, and moral chaos. Lying was normal, cheating was expected, oppressing the weak was justified, women had no dignity, orphans had no protection, and in the middle of all of this, there was one man who never bowed to an idol, never drank alcohol, never engaged in the indecency that surrounded him, never lied, never betrayed a trust. Not once, not even as a young man trying to fit in, and the people noticed. They didn't call him a philosopher, they didn't call him a poet, they didn't call him a reformer, they called him Al-Amin the Trustworthy, and they didn't give him that title as a compliment. They gave it because it was a fact of life. If you wanted something kept safe, you gave it to Muhammad. If there was a dispute, you wanted his judgment. If there was a conflict, his word carried weight. Think about that for a moment. This was a man with no political power, no army, no wealth, no authority, and yet his character alone gave him influence. That is difference. When the Quraysh rebuilt the Kaaba and argued over who would have the honor of placing the black stone, the situation almost turned violent. Swords were about to be drawn. Bloodshed was imminent. And then someone said, "Let the next man who enters decide." And when he walked in, they all said with relief, "This is Al-Amin, we accept his judgment." No debate, no hesitation. That is what moral credibility looks like. And here is what makes this even more remarkable. When revelation came, and he stood on Mount Safa and called his people to Islam, he began by asking them a simple question. If I were to tell you that an army was approaching from behind this mountain, would you believe me? And they all responded without exception, "We have never known you to lie." Never. And yet, the moment he called them to worship Allah alone, many of those same people rejected him, mocked him, persecuted him. But even then, they could not accuse him of dishonesty. They could not point to a single moral failure in his past. They could not dig up a scandal. They could not expose hypocrisy. His life before Islam was the proof of his truthfulness after Islam. Even when they opposed him, they still trusted him. When they plotted to kill him and forced him to leave Makkah, they still left their valuables with him for safekeeping. Think about the irony of that. They were trying to assassinate him, but they trusted his honesty more than anyone else in the city. This is not accidental. This is divine preparation. Allah was showing us that the message would stand on the foundation of character. That truth is not just proclaimed, it is lived. And this is why his Dawah was powerful. People didn't just hear his words, they remembered his life. He didn't need to reinvent himself when prophethood came. He didn't suddenly become ethical. He didn't suddenly become sincere. Revelation elevated what was already pure. Islam polished what was already noble, and this is where the lesson becomes deeply uncomfortable for us. Because we often want to separate belief from behavior. We want powerful words without personal integrity. We want to preach truth without embodying it. But his life shows us that credibility is earned long before a message is delivered. He was different because his private life matched his public image. He was the same man in solitude that he was in society, the same man with family that he was with strangers, the same man in ease that he was in difficulty. And that difference is why, when people finally embraced Islam, they didn't just say, "We believe in what you say." They said, "We believe in you." And that is why, even before he spoke a single verse, even before he called anyone to Allah, he had already changed hearts simply by being who he was. And that is the foundation upon which everything else was built. When revelation came and the mission began, the world did not suddenly receive a man hungry for authority. What emerged was something entirely different, a leader who redefined what leadership even meant. Because leadership in his hands was never about dominance or control, it was about responsibility, service, and moral weight, and that is precisely why he was different. In the world he lived in, leadership was inherited or seized. It was tribal, arrogant, loud, and often brutal. Leaders sat above their people, not among them. Power was displayed through wealth, fear, and lineage. And then this man stands up, calling people to Allah, and over time becomes the most influential leader Arabia had ever known without behaving like any leader they had ever seen. He never sought leadership. In fact, leadership kept finding him. When people pledged allegiance to him, it was not because he promised them land or power. It was because they trusted him. They believed he would not exploit them. They knew he would not lie to them. They sensed that he carried their burdens as his own. And when he did lead, he led from the front, not from above. He consulted, constantly. Even though revelation guided him, even though he was the messenger of Allah, he still asked for opinions. He listened to young and old, men and women, the experienced and the inexperienced. At Uhud, he accepted the opinion of the younger companions even when his own preference differed, and when the consequences were painful, he did not say, "I told you so." He absorbed the responsibility himself. That is leadership with humility. He lived the way he expected others to live. When hunger struck Medina, he tied stones to his own stomach before anyone else did. When the trench was dug, he dug alongside the companions until dust covered his clothes. When people worked, he worked. When people suffered, he suffered first. There was no separation between the leader and the led. And despite having absolute loyalty from his followers, he never demanded blind obedience. He reminded them that obedience was tied to righteousness, not personality. He taught them to question injustice, even if it came from authority. That single principle shattered centuries of tyrannical norms. Look at how he treated those beneath him in status. No throne, no guards pushing people away, no exclusive access. A stranger could walk into the masjid and ask, "Which one of you is Muhammad?" Because there was nothing externally distinguishing him from everyone else. He sat where there was space, he answered whoever spoke, he turned fully toward whoever addressed him. That is not symbolism, that is intentional humility, and yet, make no mistake, he was not weak. His leadership was firm, decisive, and courageous. When justice demanded firmness, he did not hesitate. When treaties were broken, he responded with clarity. When oppression needed to be confronted, he stood unshaken. But even then, power never corrupted his character. When Makkah finally fell, the very city that expelled him, humiliated him, and tried to kill him, he entered it not as a conqueror intoxicated by victory, but as a servant humbled by gratitude. His head was lowered, his heart was soft, and when the people who had tormented him stood before him, expecting revenge, he said words that changed history. "Go, you are free." That moment alone rewrote the definition of victory. He distributed authority, not hoarded it. He appointed leaders based on integrity, not family ties. He corrected his own governors when they erred. He accepted criticism without defensiveness. He welcomed accountability. He feared injustice more than he feared rebellion, and perhaps most striking of all is this: the more power he gained, the more humble he became. Usually, power reveals arrogance. With him, power revealed sincerity. Power revealed restraint. Power revealed mercy. He did not build a personality cult. He built a moral community. He did not attach people to himself. He attached them to Allah. He constantly reminded them that he was only a servant and a messenger. And that is why his leadership outlived him, because it was not dependent on fear, force, or charisma. It was rooted in trust, sacrifice, and principle. He was different because he showed the world that the strongest leaders are not those who rule over people, but those who carry them. And that difference is why hearts followed him long before borders did. If there is one quality that overwhelms every other description of him, it is mercy. Not a soft, selective mercy reserved for those who deserved it, but a mercy so expansive that it redefined how human beings treat one another. And this is where he was profoundly different, because in his world, mercy was seen as weakness, and cruelty was confused with strength. He lived in a society where revenge was virtue, where forgiveness was humiliation, where power was proven by how harshly you could respond. And yet, from the very beginning, he disrupted that logic. He carried a heart that absorbed pain instead of returning it, that responded to harm with patience, and that chose compassion even when retaliation was fully justified. Think about the insults, the mockery, the physical abuse. He was called a liar when everyone knew he wasn't. He was called a magician, a madman, a poet. He was choked until his cloak left marks on his neck. He was stoned until his shoes filled with blood. And after all of that, when angels offered to crush an entire town for what they had done to him, his response was not anger, it was hope. Hope that perhaps their children would one day believe that perhaps goodness could still emerge from cruelty. That is not normal human behavior, that is prophetic mercy, and it wasn't reserved only for strangers or enemies. His mercy lived in his home, he served his family, he never struck a child or a woman. He listened, he smiled, he noticed emotions, he comforted grief. When a child's bird died, he acknowledged the child's pain. When someone spoke harshly to him, he responded with calm dignity. When a Bedouin pulled his cloak so aggressively it left a mark, he smiled and gave him what he asked for. Even animals were not outside the reach of his compassion. He warned against overburdening them. He condemned cruelty toward them. He spoke of a woman punished for mistreating a cat, and another forgiven for showing mercy to a thirsty dog. He taught that mercy is not limited by species, it is a reflection of the heart. And then there is how he treated those who failed. This is critical, because many leaders are kind when people succeed, but harsh when they fall. He was the opposite. When people made mistakes, his first instinct was to protect dignity, not expose shame. He corrected privately. He softened hearts before fixing behavior. He opened doors instead of slamming them shut. A man committed a serious sin and came to confess, expecting rejection. Instead, he was guided back to Allah. Another repeatedly fell into the same mistake, and when others cursed him, he stopped them and said, "Do not help Shaitan against your brother." That sentence alone changed how communities handle failure. And then there is Makkah, always Makkah, because nothing explains his mercy better than that moment. The city that expelled him, the city that starved his people, the city that declared war on him, the city that celebrated his suffering. When he returned with absolute power, no one would have questioned retaliation. History would have justified it, and yet he stood there, looking at faces filled with fear, and chose mercy. No mass punishment, no revenge, no settling of scores. Go, you are free. In that moment, mercy conquered hearts more effectively than any army ever could. And notice this, his mercy never erased justice. He did not enable oppression. He did not excuse abuse. His compassion was principled. It protected the vulnerable and restrained the powerful. Mercy, for him, was not emotional weakness. It was moral clarity. This is why people felt safe around him. This is why the broken found refuge with him. This is why enemies softened, sinners repented, and hearts opened. Mercy was not something he occasionally practiced. It was who he was, and here is the quiet truth we often miss. His mercy was not situational, it was consistent. He was merciful when exhausted, merciful when angry, merciful when victorious, merciful when betrayed. That consistency is what made it transformative. He taught the world that strength is not measured by how hard you can strike, but by how much you can restrain yourself. That real power is not the ability to crush, but the choice not to. And that is why, centuries later, in a world still addicted to cruelty and outrage, his mercy does not feel outdated. It feels desperately necessary. When we look at the life of the Prophet, one of the most remarkable truths is how he changed society. And when I say changed society, I do not mean a minor adjustment or a cosmetic reform. I mean a complete transformation, a moral, social, economic, and spiritual revolution achieved in a society that was deeply fractured, unjust, and accustomed to cruelty. And he did this without guns, without money, without an army, and without coercion. That is why he was different. Mecca before Islam was a city of extremes. Wealth and poverty coexisted, but justice was absent. The powerful oppressed the weak. Orphans were left to struggle. Women were treated as property. Tribal identity dictated loyalty more than morality. Vendettas and revenge cycles consumed entire clans. And in the middle of this, he began a mission that would not just challenge ideas, it would change the very fabric of society. The first transformation began at the individual level. He taught people to see beyond bloodlines and social status. Every person, whether slave or noble, man or woman, had intrinsic value in the sight of Allah. He reminded society that honor is earned by righteousness, not by birth. That simple truth destabilized the foundations of pride and arrogance that had ruled Arabia for centuries. People who had never been heard before were suddenly given dignity. People who had never been protected before were suddenly shielded. He was building a community of hearts before he built cities or states. He did not stop there. He redefined economic relations. Usury and exploitation had left many destitute while a few thrived. He forbade practices that crushed the poor, instructed the wealthy to give charity, and created systems of social responsibility that protected the vulnerable. Zakat, the obligatory charity, was not just ritual. It was a method to redistribute wealth ethically and preserve dignity. The society he was building was not just moral, it was sustainable. It ensured that justice was not abstract, it was tangible. And the transformation extended to family and gender relations. Women who had been treated as property were granted rights over inheritance, marriage, and personal dignity. Slaves were treated humanely, given opportunities for freedom, and reminded that all humans are equal before Allah. He challenged norms that had been unquestioned for generations, not through force, but through reason, example, and the moral power of his character. The legal and social frameworks he established emphasized fairness and accountability. Murder, theft, and oppression were punished, yes, but through processes that valued evidence, testimony, and ethics over revenge. Justice became impartial, not a tool of the powerful. In Medina, when different tribes and faith communities came together under his leadership, he drafted a constitution, the first of its kind, that respected diversity while creating a common moral and civic ground. It was revolutionary. What is even more extraordinary is how quickly society began to change. In just a few decades, a community that had lived by tribal loyalty, bloodshed, and superstition had transformed into a society of accountability, compassion, and collective responsibility. People began to prioritize ethics over inheritance, mercy over revenge, justice over favoritism, and all of this was achieved without coercion. No one was forced to believe, no one was compelled to obey, but hearts followed, communities shifted, and change happened organically. And even when faced with opposition, he never responded with cruelty. His reforms were not imposed through fear, but through persuasion, example, and moral authority. This is a critical point. Societal transformation is not sustainable when it is enforced through fear or coercion. What he accomplished was deep, internal, and enduring because he changed hearts before he changed laws. His methods show us that true change is holistic. It is not enough to legislate justice or preach morality. Society only shifts when individuals internalize values and apply them in every aspect of life, in business, in family, in governance, in personal conduct. He taught people to take responsibility for themselves, for their neighbors, and for society at large. This is why the change he brought about endured long after he passed away. And perhaps the most compelling lesson for us today is this: transformation begins with character, spreads through example, and solidifies in institutions and community. He did not merely create followers. He created a living society anchored in ethics, compassion, and justice. And that is why he was different, because he did not just preach change, he lived it, embodied it, and left a legacy that continues to transform the world. What truly sets him apart is the way he lived his relationship with Allah. His connection with God was not a distant formality, nor a series of rituals performed out of obligation. It was intimate, constant, and deeply transformative. And this is where he was profoundly different, because while many leaders in history rely on their own power, charisma, or intelligence, he relied entirely on Allah. Power never corrupted him, authority never inflated his ego, and responsibility never overwhelmed his humility. From the earliest days of revelation, we see a man who was entirely dependent on Allah. When Jibril came to him in the cave, he did not respond with arrogance or self-assurance. He was frightened, he trembled. He sought guidance and protection from the one who had created him. His first words, "I am not able," reflect humility, not weakness. They reflect a man who understood that greatness is rooted not in self, but in submission to God. This connection was not sporadic or performative. It was woven into every part of his life. He would pray at night while the city slept, long hours in devotion, sometimes until his feet swelled. He would fast beyond the obligatory days, seeking closeness to Allah. He would supplicate constantly, turning to Allah in gratitude, in worry, in joy, and in sorrow. His life was a living demonstration that true strength comes from surrender, not dominance, and this reliance on Allah shaped his decisions, his leadership, and his interactions with people. When faced with impossibly difficult situations, battles, migrations, betrayals, or opposition from his own tribe, he would consult Allah first, seek guidance, and then act. He made no rash decisions. He did not act out of pride, ambition, or impulse. His every action was measured against divine guidance. That is why even in the most turbulent moments, his judgment was sound, his strategy effective, and his character unwavering. His humility in the face of responsibility is especially striking. He carried the weight of an entire community, yet he never thought of himself as above others. He prayed for forgiveness even after fulfilling the greatest of obligations. He recognized his own limitations, acknowledging that without Allah's guidance, he could do nothing. Power and influence did not inflate his sense of self. They deepened his consciousness of dependence on God. Even in moments of victory and triumph, his heart remained grounded in gratitude, not pride. When Makkah was conquered, when treaties were signed, when enemies submitted, he did not celebrate his own genius or leadership. He raised his hands to the sky, thanking Allah for guidance, for protection, for mercy. That is what makes him different. Power magnified his humility rather than his ego. It magnified his devotion rather than his authority. And perhaps most strikingly, his relationship with Allah was the source of his moral consistency. When people faltered, when society resisted, when threats loomed, he never abandoned ethics. He never compromised justice, truth, or mercy. Why? Because his moral compass was not based on human approval or social convenience. It was anchored in his connection to Allah. That is what allowed him to remain incorruptible, even under pressure, even when tempted by the same ambitions that sway so many leaders. His trust in Allah also taught those around him resilience and courage. The companions saw a man who faced overwhelming odds and never panicked. They saw a man who consulted, planned, and then entrusted the results entirely to Allah. That reliance was not passive, it was active and purposeful. He worked hard, strategized, guided, and then placed the outcome in the hands of the one who controls all things. This balance of effort and reliance is a lesson that continues to resonate. And beyond leadership, his spiritual life shaped society at large. His prayers, his acts of devotion, his constant remembrance of Allah inspired a community to aspire toward righteousness. The people did not merely follow him because of his social authority. They followed him because of his spiritual integrity. They saw in him a man whose actions flowed naturally from his connection with God, and that authenticity transformed lives. He was different because his closeness to Allah was not an abstract ideal. It was practical, lived, and visible. It informed every ethical decision, every interaction, every moment of leadership, every act of mercy. His relationship with God was the lens through which he viewed the world, the source of his strength, and the foundation of his legacy. And that is why he was different, because in a world where power can corrupt, authority can blind, and responsibility can overwhelm, he remained utterly, unwaveringly connected to Allah. What makes him different is not only how he lived in his time, but how his impact has echoed across centuries and continents, long after he left this world. There are countless leaders, philosophers, and revolutionaries whose influence faded with time. Their words were powerful for a moment, their actions impressive in context, but eventually history moved on. His message, however, did not fade, it grew. And that is the final and perhaps most remarkable way he was different. He lived in a society that was fragmented, tribal, and resistant to change. Yet the principles he established, justice, mercy, compassion, equality, accountability, were so profound that they transcended time and culture. They spoke not only to the Arabs of the 7th century, but to every human heart capable of understanding fairness, truth, and purpose. Even today, people who have never read a page of the Quran can recognize the power of his character, the clarity of his message, and the depth of his ethics. That universality is rare. That lasting impact is extraordinary. Consider the scale of his influence. In just over 23 years of public mission, he transformed not only individuals, but communities, economies, legal systems, and societal norms. The change he initiated did not rely on armies, wealth, or coercion. It relied on moral authority, the strength of character, and the clarity of a message rooted in truth. And because it was rooted in truth, it did not diminish with time. Falsehoods, regimes, and fleeting ideologies come and go, but truth endures, and his life and message were a living manifestation of that truth. Even his opponents recognized it. Those who resisted him during his life could not deny his integrity. Generations that came later were compelled to study him, respect him, and often emulate his principles. The Quran, revealed to guide humanity, became a beacon for countless people across the globe. His Sunnah, the practical example of his life, became a blueprint for moral, social, and spiritual living. The impact was not limited to followers who shared his faith. Scholars, historians, ethicists, and thinkers across cultures and centuries have acknowledged the transformative nature of his leadership, character, and vision. And the reason his influence is enduring is because it is adaptable without losing its essence. His message was not bound to a single culture, geography, or political system. It speaks to the human condition itself. Concepts like justice, compassion, mercy, dignity, and accountability are timeless. They are not tied to the 7th century Arabian Peninsula. They are applicable wherever humans live, struggle, and strive for meaning. Societies rise and fall, leaders come and go, but principles that touch the soul endure. He was different because his impact was cumulative. Every action, every teaching, every moment of mercy, every instance of honesty, every act of leadership added to a legacy that could not be erased. It was not a temporary achievement. It was a transformation that grew stronger with time. His message continued to inspire reformers, thinkers, and everyday people across generations. From the earliest Muslims to the present day, his influence has shaped laws, ethics, social justice, governance, and personal conduct. That is not accidental. That is a reflection of divine guidance channeled through a life lived with perfect alignment of character, intention, and action. Even the smallest acts he performed created ripples that extended far beyond their immediate context. A word of kindness, a lesson in patience, a demonstration of justice, these were not isolated gestures. They were seeds planted in the soil of human consciousness, which continue to grow today. Every society that has embraced his teachings has been transformed in its own way. Every heart that internalizes his example finds guidance, moral clarity, and hope. And perhaps the most profound aspect of this lasting impact is the way it challenges every generation anew. Each era faces its own trials, its own moral crises, its own social fractures. Yet the example he left provides answers that remain relevant. The challenges change, but the principles endure. That is why his life is studied, his words are remembered, and his example continues to shape humanity, not because of cultural nostalgia, but because it meets the deepest needs of the human heart and society. He was different because his influence is not measured in monuments or titles, but in lives changed, societies reformed, and hearts transformed. Power and authority fade, wealth is fleeting, fame is temporary, but the legacy of someone who reshaped humanity through moral excellence, wisdom, and divine guidance endures across centuries. And that is why he was different, because his message did not end with his life, it continues to grow, to guide, and to transform the world.